The streets were quiet as the young man walked home. It was late, and the city had settled into that eerie calm that always followed the evening rush. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the pavement, breaking the silence. He was tired after a long day of work, his mind still heavy with the thoughts of the office bills and responsibilities. All he wanted was to get home, grab a cold drink, and collapse onto the couch. He was almost at the corner of his street when he noticed something unusual. A figure in the distance caught his attention, a strange silhouette against the dim light of a street lamp. At first he thought it was just another homeless person or someone stumbling drunk in the night, but as he got closer, his curiosity grew. There was something about the figure that didn't sit right. The closer he got, the more the figure came into focus. It was a girl, or at least that's what it looked like at first, but there was something odd about her appearance, something otherworldly. She was tied to a street sign, her hands bound with thick, rough ropes. Her long, dark hair hung loosely over her shoulders, and her clothes were strange, foreign-looking, almost like something from another time. But the thing that made him stop in his tracks was the sign around her neck. It was a small piece of cardboard, taped to her chest with a simple message written in bold, hurried handwriting. "Take her for a bottle of liquor." His heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Who would do something like this? And why would anyone leave a girl tied up on a street corner with such a bizarre sign around her neck? He paused, his mind racing with questions. There was no one else around, just the quiet of the night. For a moment he considered walking away. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe she was just another lost soul. But something about her, her stillness, her quietness, made him feel like this was more than it seemed. She didn't look like someone who had gotten drunk and ended up in a bad situation. She looked scared, vulnerable. He swallowed hard and stepped closer, unsure of what he was doing. As he approached, the girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. They were an unusual shade of green, almost glowing in the dim light. They didn't look human, and that sent a chill down his spine. But there was something in her gaze that seemed to say she needed help. He hesitated for a second, then made his decision. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaky but kind. The girl didn't respond. She simply looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. She tried to speak, but the words came out in a language he didn't understand. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. Soft and melodic, yet alien. He bent down slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. The last thing he wanted was to scare her even more. He reached out and gently touched the ropes that bound her wrists, trying to figure out how to untie them. As his fingers worked on the knot, he noticed that her skin was colder than it should have been, colder than any human skin would be. His heart pounded in his chest. What was going on? Was she even human? And who had left her like this? With a little effort, he finally managed to untie the ropes. The girl's hands were trembling, and as soon as the ropes fell away, she stood up, her movements jerky and awkward. She looked at him again, as though trying to make sense of his presence. Her eyes were full of questions, but no answers. He stepped back, giving her space. She looked fragile, like a bird that had been trapped in a cage for too long, unsure whether to fly or stay. The young man watched her closely, trying to understand what was happening. "Who are you?" he asked softly, even though he didn't expect an answer. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she shook her head, almost as if she didn't know who she was either. There was a strange sadness in her eyes, as if she had lost something important and couldn't find it again. He looked down at the sign around her neck. He read the words again. "Take her for a bottle of liquor." The more he thought about it, the more the situation made no sense. Why was she here? Why had someone tied her up? And why the strange sign? The young man felt a mix of anger and confusion. Whoever had done this to her was cruel, but he didn't know what to do next. He couldn't just leave her here on the street, but he also didn't know where to take her. He didn't even know who she was or what she needed. She stepped forward suddenly, almost as if she had made a decision. Her eyes met his again, and this time there was a hint of something else in her gaze, a kind of pleading. She didn't have to say anything for him to understand. She was asking for his help. Without fully thinking it through, he made his choice. "Come with me," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll take you somewhere safe." She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, her gaze softening. The young man turned and began walking toward his apartment, with the strange girl following silently behind him. The night felt heavier now, charged with a sense of something unspoken, something not quite right. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she ended up here, tied to a sign on a dark street corner with a strange message around her neck? He didn't have the answers, but he was determined to find out. The young man hadn't expected his decision to be so heavy. As he led the strange girl towards his apartment, his mind was racing with unanswered questions. Who was she? What was she doing here, tied to a sign with a bizarre message? He glanced back at her as she walked behind him, her strange, almost ethereal presence unsettling in the dim light of the street. She didn't speak, just followed silently. Her eyes locked on him with a quiet intensity that made him feel like he was being watched in ways he couldn't fully understand. They reached his apartment building in silence, and as they climbed the stairs, the weight of the situation settled on him. He didn't know what he was doing. Why was he bringing her into his home? A strange girl who might not even be human had appeared out of nowhere, and he was about to let her into his life. He had never been one to take risks, but something about her made him feel like he didn't have a choice. It was almost as if she had become a part of him, whether he wanted it or not. Inside the apartment, the girl hesitated at the door, her fingers grazing the frame as though she were unsure whether she belonged there. The young man held the door open for her, offering a reassuring smile. "Come on in. You're safe here," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She stepped inside, her movements still cautious but more fluid than before. She looked around, taking in the simple furniture and the soft, warm glow of the lights. Her gaze lingered on the room, studying everything like she was seeing it for the first time. He set down his bag and walked into the small kitchen. "I'll get you something to drink," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Water, I guess. Maybe you're thirsty." She didn't answer, but she nodded slightly as if understanding the offer. He turned on the tap and filled a glass, watching her as he did. There was an almost unsettling calmness about her. The way she stood motionless, her eyes scanning the room like she was trying to process everything at once, felt unnatural. When he handed her the glass, she took it gently, her fingers cool to the touch. She didn't drink immediately. Instead, she stared at the water, almost mesmerized by it. Finally, she raised it to her lips and drank slowly, her gaze never leaving him. Do you speak English?" he asked, his voice tentative. He didn't know how to communicate with her. He barely even knew how to talk to people on a normal day, let alone someone who might not even be human. She looked at him, then nodded faintly, but still said nothing. It was as if she was trying to understand the sounds coming from his mouth, as though her mind needed more time to adjust. The young man sighed, sitting down across from her at the small dining table. "All right, we need to figure this out," he muttered to himself. "You're not from around here, are you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she placed the empty glass back on the table with delicate precision, as though it was the most important thing she'd done all day. "Where are you from?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. She tilted her head, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She looked almost confused, and it dawned on him that she probably didn't know how to answer that. She wasn't from this world. He could see it now. The way she moved, the way her skin glimmered under the soft light. There was something otherworldly about her. She wasn't human, at least not in the way he understood the word. He stood up, walking to his bookshelf and pulling down an atlas. He didn't know why. He wasn't even sure she could understand what he was pointing at. But somehow he felt the need to try. He opened the map to a random page and pointed at the countries and cities marked on it. "Do you know this place? Or this one?" he asked, running his finger over the names. "This is Earth, this is where we are." She glanced at the map, but her eyes didn't linger. Instead, she stared at the finger he had used to point. Her gaze was intense, almost as though she could feel the movements of his hand through the air. She reached out, touching the map gently, her fingers trailing over the paper with a kind of reverence. The moment her fingers touched the map, something strange happened. The air around them seemed to hum, a soft vibration that only grew louder with each passing second. The lights flickered and the room grew colder. He stepped back, startled. The sensation was unnerving, like something was alive in the very atmosphere just beyond his reach. He looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you do that?" he asked, his voice shaky. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. The humming stopped almost as quickly as it had started. and the room returned to its usual quiet state. She simply nodded, her eyes dark and distant as though she were lost in a thought much older than the young man could comprehend. "Who are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. She wasn't just some strange girl, she wasn't even a person like him. Zara, he had learned her name, looked at him then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him shiver. Her lips parted, and for the first time since they had met, she spoke. "Not from here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not from Earth." The young man froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had suspected it, but hearing the words out loud made it all too real. The girl, Zara, wasn't from this world. He stared at her, the gravity of the moment sinking in. This wasn't some random encounter. This wasn't just a girl in need of help. This was something far beyond his understanding. Something that would change everything he knew. And it all started with that strange sign. Take her for a bottle of liquor. He didn't know it yet, but that was only the beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything the young man had ever experienced. Zara, his mysterious guest, had settled into his apartment, though it was clear that neither of them truly knew what to do next. It was a strange and surreal situation. A girl who wasn't from Earth with powers beyond explanation, living in a small, cluttered apartment with an ordinary guy who had never asked for any of this. But somehow it felt like they had both been brought together by forces larger than either of them could understand. Zara didn't speak much, her few words still foreign to him, but the language barrier wasn't what concerned him. What disturbed him more were the strange events that seemed to follow her wherever she went. At first it was subtle, a flicker of light in the corner of his vision, objects shifting slightly when no one was looking. He told himself it was nothing, just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. But as the days wore on, it became harder to ignore. One evening, as he sat on the couch trying to watch TV and pretend that everything was normal, Zara stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. Her gaze seemed distant, as though she was looking at something far beyond the concrete buildings and flickering streetlights. He noticed how she seemed to study every tiny detail, her focus so intense it was almost unsettling. "Are you all right?" he asked, glancing at her. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her hand rose slowly to touch the window pane. Her fingers brushed against it lightly. But the moment she made contact, something strange happened. The air around her crackled, a faint hum filling the room, and the window began to frost over, spreading like a spreading ink blot. Within seconds, the glass was covered in a thin layer of ice despite the warm indoor temperature. His mouth went dry. "Zara," he began, his voice trembling. "What did you do?" She turned to look at him, her eyes wide and unblinking as though she hadn't even noticed the effect her touch had caused. Her lips parted, but no words came. The frost melted away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the window clear once more. "I don't understand," she murmured almost to herself. Her voice was soft, tinged with confusion. "I didn't mean to. It just happens." He stood, walking slowly towards her, trying to process the sight he had just witnessed. You didn't mean to?" "But that's impossible. The glass just froze by itself." Zara seemed to shrink into herself, as though the question had caused her to retreat further into her own thoughts. She looked down at her hands as if trying to figure out how they could have caused such an effect. The young man wanted to ask more questions, but he could see that she was troubled by the event, so he held back. Instead, he offered her a glass of water, which she took without hesitation. But something about the way she drank it caught his attention. She didn't drink like a human would. There was no gulping, no swallowing. Her lips barely parted as the water seemed to almost hover in the air before it slowly disappeared, absorbed into her skin. The young man blinked in disbelief. "You didn't drink it," he said, almost accusingly. Zara lowered the glass, looking at him with the same calm expression she always wore. "I don't need it," she explained. "Not in the way you do. I can absorb it differently." His mind raced. The girl could freeze windows with a touch, and now she was drinking in a way he couldn't even begin to understand. What was she? What had she become? Was she even truly alive in the way he understood? "What are you?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Zara looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something. She set the glass down, stepping closer to him. "I don't know," she said, the words soft but heavy with meaning. "I don't remember much, only fragments. I remember the mission. I remember being sent here, but I don't remember who I was before." Her voice trailed off, and he could see the pain in her eyes. Whatever had happened to her, it had taken more than just her memories. It had taken a part of her that she couldn't retrieve, a part that left her feeling lost in a world that wasn't hers. Before he could ask her anything else, a sudden crash from the kitchen made both of them jump. The young man spun around to see a glass jar on the counter had tipped over, spilling its contents all over the floor. He took a step towards it, but Zara moved faster. She knelt down quickly, her fingers hovering over the mess. He watched in awe as the spilled liquid seemed to move in slow motion, floating upward, defying gravity. The water from the jar swirled around in the air, slowly gathering into a perfect sphere before gently falling back into the jar. It was as if Zara had willed the liquid to move with her thoughts alone. "No visible force, no explanation, Zara," he whispered, unable to keep the astonishment from his voice. "How did you do that?" Her eyes met his, but there was no joy or pride in her gaze, only a deep sadness, like she was afraid of the powers that lay within her. "I don't know," she said again, her voice barely audible. "It just happens. Sometimes. I can't control it." He could see that she was struggling with her abilities, even if she didn't fully understand them herself. The more he saw, the more the sense of unease grew. What if these powers were more dangerous than he realized? What if Zara's presence in his life was going to lead to something far darker than he could ever imagine? But still, there was something about her, something that drew him in despite the unknown dangers. She wasn't human, but she wasn't a threat either, at least not yet. He found himself wanting to protect her, even though he didn't know how to protect himself from what was happening. Over the next few days, the strange events continued to escalate. Zara's powers became more unpredictable. A lamp flickered and broke one morning as she entered the room. A book slipped from its shelf as she passed by. Each time she would apologize softly, as if she were sorry for something she couldn't help. But with every unexplained phenomenon, the young man felt a sense of foreboding. It was clear now that Zara wasn't just an alien in appearance. Her very presence seemed to alter reality itself. And as much as he wanted to help her, the question lingered in his mind. What was she running from? And what would happen if the world ever found out who or what she really was? The tension in the apartment had been growing steadily. The young man couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something beyond his control. Zara's presence, while strangely comforting, felt increasingly like an invitation to chaos. The strange occurrences continued, objects shifting, lights flickering, even the temperature of the room changing suddenly. But that wasn't what kept him up at night. It was the questions. The more he learned about Zara, the more confusing everything became. It was one evening, a few days after the glass jar incident, when things started to unravel. The young man had been sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, staring at the same map of the world he had shown Zara weeks ago. He had been trying to find a way to understand what was happening, trying to figure out why she was here. But so far there were no answers, only more questions. Zara was sitting by the window again, her hands pressed against the glass, staring out at the world she still couldn't fully comprehend. The light from the setting sun cast a golden hue across her features, highlighting the softness of her face but also the sadness in her eyes. She had seemed lost, ever since she had arrived. It was as though she were searching for something she couldn't remember, something important that had been erased from her mind. The young man set down his coffee and stood, walking slowly toward her. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, unsure of what to ask, but desperate to understand. "Zara," he said quietly, "why don't you tell me everything? You don't have to hide it from me anymore. I want to know. Who are you, really? Where did you come from?" Her eyes flickered to him, and for the first time he saw something shift in her expression, something like fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from being trapped or cornered. It was the kind of fear that comes from knowing something was about to change, something irreversible. She stood up from the window, walking over to the table where he sat. Her presence was calm, but the air around her seemed to buzz with an energy that made his heart race. He could feel it in his bones now. Whatever she was powerful. More powerful than he could ever understand. You're right, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It's time you knew. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to be afraid of me. But now, I think you deserve to know. The young man leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her, every part of him wanting to hear the truth. Zara took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. I'm not from this world, she began, her voice steady but filled with a sadness that tugged at his heart. I was sent here on a mission, an important one. My name isn't really Zara. It's just a name I was given for this mission. But my true name is something I can barely remember. The young man frowned, trying to process her words. What mission? What are you talking about? Zara closed her eyes for a moment as though she were trying to recall something long buried. When she spoke again, her voice was distant as though she were reliving the memories. I was sent to Earth by my people, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession. We are part of an advanced race, a species far older and far more powerful than humans. Our purpose is to observe. Observe your planet, your people. But there's something else, something I was meant to find. I was sent to Earth to retrieve an artifact, a key that would unlock the potential of your species. The young man felt a chill run down his spine. The room suddenly felt colder, as if the very air around him had shifted. What do you mean, unlock the potential of humanity? He asked, his voice shaking slightly. Zara looked at him, her eyes now filled with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. It's not something I wanted to do. I didn't agree with the plan. My people believed that humanity was on the verge of something great, something dangerous, and that we needed to guide you, control you, before you destroyed yourselves. But I didn't want to help them. I rebelled. The young man's heart raced. His mind was reeling. So, you came here to help humanity? To save us? She shook her head. No, I came here to stop my people, to stop them from taking control of your world, from manipulating your species for their own purposes. I don't know how, but the artifact I was meant to find could change everything. It could give humanity the power to stand on its own, without the influence of those who would control you. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the young man couldn't speak. The implications were enormous beyond anything he could have imagined. An alien sent to Earth to stop an alien race from taking over. It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, but here she was, right in front of him, standing as proof that the impossible was real. So what happened? He asked, trying to pull himself together. What went wrong? Why are you here? Zara sighed, her gaze distant. I was captured before I could finish my mission. I don't know how, but I was. My memories were wiped, and I was left to wander, lost. That's why I don't remember everything. I was confused when I first arrived, not knowing where I was or why. But now I remember enough. The young man sat back in his chair, processing the weight of her confession. This wasn't just a girl in need of help. This was a being from another world, caught between two forces she couldn't control. She wasn't just running from her people. She was fighting them, fighting for the very future of humanity itself. I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. This is all. So much to take in. Zara nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. I understand. I never wanted you to be involved in this, but I need your help. I can't do this alone. And the longer I stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. My people will come for me. They'll stop at nothing to find me, and they'll do whatever it takes to complete the mission they sent me here for. The young man sat there for a long moment, considering her words. He had never asked for any of this. He had never expected his life to change in such an extraordinary way. But now that it had, he knew there was no turning back. All right, he said finally, his voice firm with a determination he hadn't expected to feel. I'll help you. We'll figure this out together. Whatever it takes. Zara's eyes softened, and for the first time a small, genuine smile flickered on her face. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means to me. And as the young man looked at her, He realized that, despite the overwhelming uncertainty of what lay ahead, he was ready to face whatever came next. Because one thing was certain: the world would never be the same again. The next few days were a blur of half-formed plans and whispered conversations. The apartment, once a place of solitude and routine, now hummed with the weight of secrets. Zara, the girl who wasn't from this world, had become an enigma he couldn't stop thinking about. But more than that, she had become a strange, unexpected presence in his life, a force he didn't fully understand, but couldn't deny. And with that presence came a bond, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. He found himself spending more time with her, trying to understand the complexities of her world, her mission, her people, and the purpose that had brought her to Earth. She was different from anyone he had ever known. Her quiet strength, the way she moved through the world with an air of disconnection, as though she were constantly observing, always calculating. But there was also a vulnerability to her, one that tugged at something deep inside him. Despite her otherworldly powers and the weight of her responsibility, Zara wasn't invincible. She was lost, scared, and uncertain, just like him. The more he learned about her, the more he realized that they were both running from something. She was escaping the reach of her own kind, the very beings who had sent her here to manipulate humanity. But he was running from the monotony of his own life, the quiet, predictable existence that had become suffocating in its normalcy. Now, with Zara in his life, everything had changed. The world was no longer just a place of daily routines. It was a place full of possibilities, of dangers, and of an unknown future that neither of them could avoid. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, a rare moment of calm settled over them. Zara had been quieter than usual, lost in her thoughts, her gaze distant. The young man sat across from her, watching as she seemed to examine the world around her, as if trying to place herself in it, to make sense of her new reality. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the longing for something she couldn't reach, and it made him ache. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. "Zara," he said softly, breaking the silence. "You've been so quiet lately. What's on your mind?" She turned her head to look at him, her green eyes shining in the soft light of the room. For a moment she said nothing, as though weighing her words carefully. Then she spoke, her voice a little strained. "I'm just thinking about everything," she said, her tone low. "About why I'm here, about what I'm supposed to do. I was sent to stop my people, to stop them from taking over. But now, I'm not sure what the right thing is anymore." Her words hung in the air, and the young man felt a pang of empathy. He could understand that feeling, the uncertainty of not knowing whether the choices you were making were the right ones. He'd felt that way about his own life for a long time. But with Zara, it felt different. Her struggle wasn't just about the usual fears and doubts people dealt with. She was carrying the weight of an entire species, the fate of humanity itself hanging in the balance. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling in his chest. "I know this is bigger than both of us, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it all by yourself. We'll figure this out, together." Zara's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, the young man saw a flicker of hope in her expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. She didn't answer immediately, but the way she looked at him told him more than words ever could. There was something about their connection that went beyond the physical realm. It wasn't just about him helping her or her needing his assistance. It was about something deeper, something neither of them could easily define. Over the next few days, they began to grow closer. The tension between them shifted, becoming less about the overwhelming nature of their circumstances and more about a shared understanding. As they spent time together, Zara began to open up more, revealing bits and pieces of her past. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him see her not just as an alien or a mission-driven force of nature, but as a person, someone who had once been just like him, someone with dreams, fears, and hopes. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing at all. He told her about his life before all of this, about his childhood, his family, his job. It was a simple life, a comfortable one. but it had never felt meaningful until Zara had appeared. Now every day felt like an adventure, even if it was filled with uncertainty. Zara in turn shared fragments of her memories, glimpses of her home, her people, and the mission she had been assigned to. She spoke of her world with a mixture of awe and regret, as though she were caught between the beauty of her origins and the darkness of what she had been sent to do. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the apartment, a new tension lingered in the air. The young man could sense that Zara was struggling with something deep inside her. She had been restless lately, her movements more agitated than usual, her gaze distant. "Zara, what's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle. "You've been different. What are you not telling me?" She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge whether she could trust him with whatever it was that was bothering her. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been having dreams," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "Dreams of my people, of the mission. And in these dreams I see something I didn't expect. I see them coming for me, coming for both of us." The young man's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Zara closed her eyes, her brow furrowing as if the images from her dreams were too vivid, too real. "They're not just searching for me anymore. They're looking for both of us now. They know I'm here and they won't stop until they find me, until they find us." His stomach tightened with fear. It wasn't just her mission anymore. It was his too. He had become a part of her struggle and now there was no turning back. "Then we'll fight," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We'll find a way to stop them. You're not alone in this. We'll make sure they never get to you." Zara looked at him, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite place. Relief, gratitude, and something more. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time since they'd met, she reached out to touch him. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise, one that neither of them could break. And as their hands touched, something shifted between them. It was as if the world around them stood still, the weight of their shared connection stronger than ever. The young man knew in that moment that whatever came next, they would face it together. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it deep in his bones. The world was changing, and so were they. The quiet of the apartment had begun to crack under the pressure of the impending storm. The days of peace they had shared, a fragile bubble of calm in a world that had no place for Zara, were drawing to an end. Her warning that her people would come for both of them had not been a passing fear. It was a reality, one that was closing in faster than either of them could prepare for. The young man could feel it in the air, a tightening, like a coil waiting to snap. It started with strange noises, distant footsteps outside, shadows that moved a little too quickly across the street below, figures that seemed to be watching them from the corners of their vision. It wasn't long before Zara, who had always been quiet and withdrawn, became more alert, her senses sharper than ever. She could feel them coming long before the young man even noticed. He had been sitting on the couch one evening trying to lose himself in a book, but the silence between them was too heavy. Zara had gone to the window again, her gaze fixed on the street below, her expression unreadable. "They're close," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel them." He stood up quickly, his heart racing. He had known this moment would come, but it was still terrifying to face. "How long do we have?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were scanning the street below, her brow furrowed with concentration. Then after a tense silence, she spoke. "Maybe an hour. Maybe less," the young man's mind raced. They had to get out of the apartment. They had to leave before they were cornered. The thought of running, of abandoning everything he had known, made his stomach churn. But the alternative, waiting for them to come to him, was unthinkable. Whoever Zara's people were, they weren't going to play fair. "We need to go," he said, moving quickly towards the door. "Get your things now." Zara's eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable. She didn't move, didn't react. She was already preparing herself for what was to come, the inevitable confrontation. She had been ready long before he had. "I don't have much to take," she said simply, turning back to the window, her posture stiff with tension. "I've been running for so long, there's nothing left for me to take." The young man hesitated for a moment, watching her. He had always been someone who preferred to keep things safe, to stay in the comfort of the known. But now, standing next to Zara, everything he had once considered important felt so distant, so insignificant. What was a life of comfort worth if it meant ignoring the fight of a lifetime? "Let's go," he said again, more firmly this time. "You're not alone in this. I'm with you." For a moment it seemed as if she would argue, but then she nodded, a barely perceptible movement. She stepped away from the window, her face resolute. She had been alone for so long, fighting battles no one had known about. But now she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Now she had someone beside her. They moved quickly, gathering only what they could carry in haste. There was no time for hesitation. The world outside was already closing in on them. As they reached the door, the young man's heart raced, his every instinct screaming at him to run, to escape. But there was no escape. Not really. Zara's people would find them no matter where they went. They made it to the street, and for a brief moment it felt like they had gotten away cleanly. The air was cool, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. But as they turned the corner, the young man's eyes widened in horror. There, at the end of the street, were two figures. They were standing still, but there was no mistaking the way they moved. Too fluid, too controlled, like predators waiting for their prey. Zara's body went rigid at his side. She had sensed them before he had, and now she was moving before he could say a word. She grabbed his arm, her grip unyielding, and pulled him into a narrow alley between two buildings. The young man's heart pounded in his chest as they hurried through the shadows, Zara leading the way, her pace frantic. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice tense with urgency. "They're here. They've found us." He didn't need to ask who they were. He had already figured that much out. Zara's enemies, her own people, had come for them. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a war, one that would tear apart everything they had worked for, everything they had hoped. They moved through the maze of alleyways, but every turn they took seemed to lead them closer to the danger. The young man could hear footsteps behind them now, soft but unmistakable, echoing in the distance. Whoever they were, they weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They knew they had the advantage. "We need to find somewhere to hide," he said, his voice tight with panic. Zara nodded, her face pale, but there was a strange determination in her eyes. "There's an old warehouse up ahead. I can take us there." Without another word, she led him down a dark alley that seemed to wind endlessly. The city around them felt like a labyrinth, and the young man could almost feel the walls closing in on him. He could hear the footsteps growing louder, closer. Whoever was chasing them was getting nearer, and there was nowhere to run. As they reached the warehouse, Zara pushed open a rusted door, the creak of metal cutting through the silence like a knife. They slipped inside, the heavy door shutting behind them with a soft thud. The air was cold and musty inside, the darkness thick, but Zara seemed to know exactly where she was going. She motioned for him to follow as she moved deeper into the shadows. The young man's heart was racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had never been in a situation like this before, had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. It wasn't just about the chase anymore. It was about survival. Zara turned to him, her face serious. "We can't stay here for long. They'll search the building. We need to get to higher ground, find a way out before they trap us." He nodded, though fear gnawed at his insides. What if they didn't make it out? What if this was the end? But as Zara grabbed his arm, pulling him further into the dark, he realized something. This wasn't just about survival for her anymore. It was about more than that. It was about choosing to fight, to face the impossible odds together. And for the first time since they had met, the young man wasn't afraid. The cold, damp air of the warehouse seemed to seep into the young man's bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill running through his mind. The clanging echoes of footsteps outside had only grown louder, reverberating off the metal walls of the abandoned building. Zara's eyes were sharp, darting between shadows, her body tense with the kind of focus that came from a lifetime of running, of hiding, of never being able to rest. She wasn't just trying to survive now. She was trying to protect him. And it was becoming clearer to him with every passing moment. He was no longer just an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. He was part of this now, tied to her in a way that neither of them could deny. He had no choice but to face it head-on, whatever it was, but the weight of the decision was overwhelming. Zara turned toward him, her eyes searching his face, her expression softening for a fraction of a second before she masked it again. "They're closing in," she said quietly, her voice a mix of concern and resignation. "We don't have much time. They'll find us and they won't let us leave alive. They're relentless." He nodded, his throat tight with the knowledge that this was the final stretch, the moment when everything they had fought for would either fall apart or take shape. The consequences of their choices felt impossible to ignore. For the first time in days, the young man took a deep breath and spoke what had been weighing on him since they'd left the apartment. "What if they're right?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "What if you're supposed to stop humanity from having this power? What if we're not ready for it? What if we're just digging our own graves by trying to fight them?" Zara stared at him, her eyes softening. It was the first time he'd seen her vulnerable in this way. She had always been the one with the answers, the one who had a mission, a purpose. But now, as she stood before him, the uncertainty in her eyes mirrored his own. "They're wrong," she replied firmly. "My people are wrong. They think they can control humanity, control you, but you don't need anyone's help to decide your own fate. This is your world. You have the right to make your own choices." Her words were like a balm to his fraying nerves, a reminder that for all her power, for all the alien forces at play, she had a deep respect for him, for humanity. But that didn't change the fact that they were running out of time. Suddenly, a harsh light from a flashlight pierced the darkness of the warehouse. The young man froze, his pulse spiking. From the corner of the room, Zara moved quickly, her movements sharp and deliberate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him deeper into the shadows. "Stay close," she whispered, her breath ragged with urgency. "They found us." The young man's heart hammered in his chest as the sounds of their pursuers grew nearer. The footsteps were no longer distant. They were in the building, and the soft hum of technology in the air told him that the figures chasing them were no longer just human. They had tools, they had weapons, and worse, they had knowledge of everything Zara could do. The realization hit him like a wave. These weren't just enemies trying to stop Zara's mission. These were people who were willing to destroy everything to secure their version of the future. If they were successful, they would control not only Zara, but the fate of every person on this planet. "We need to make a choice," Zara said, her voice low but urgent as she pulled him further into the maze of crates and discarded equipment. "If they catch us, it's over. I won't let them use me or you to bring about their plan, but there's another way." The young man's mind was spinning. "What other way?" Zara's eyes flicked around the darkened room. She seemed to be calculating her next move, weighing every possibility in that alien mind of hers. "The artifact I was sent to retrieve, it's real. It's hidden here, somewhere on Earth. It has the power to change everything, to give humanity the ability to decide its own future. But I can't get it to you, not alone." He felt a lump form in his throat. "But you said we could stop them." "You can stop them. You don't have to do this alone." "We don't have to." Zara took a breath, her eyes meeting his with the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "I can't let you get involved any more than you already have. The power that artifact holds, if it falls into the wrong hands, no one will be safe. Not even you." He could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke. She was trying to protect him, but he couldn't just stand by. He had already chosen to fight. He had already chosen her. They were in this together now, and whatever came next, he would face it with her. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "We'll find a way to protect it together. If we have to face them, then we will. But not alone." For a moment, Zara stood still, her gaze fixed on him, as if weighing his words carefully. Then slowly she nodded, a small reluctant smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I knew you'd say that." The young man could hear the sound of footsteps growing louder, the flashlights cutting through the darkness. They didn't have much time. They had no plan, no guarantee that they would succeed. But they had one thing that the pursuers didn't: each other. Zara grabbed his hand, pulling him along as they ran through the maze of the warehouse, the sound of the pursuit hot on their heels. He could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins, his heart pounding in his ears. There was no turning back now. They had crossed the point of no return. They reached a narrow staircase at the back of the warehouse, leading to an old loft above. Without hesitation, they scrambled up the stairs, Zara's strength guiding them as they moved with speed and precision. The young man felt a flicker of hope ignite inside him. They weren't alone, and together they were unstoppable. At the top of the stairs, Zara paused, her hand on the edge of the attic door. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once we open this door, there's no going back. The artifact is close, but I can't guarantee we'll make it out alive." He looked at her, his heart steady despite the chaos around them. "Then let's go." Together they pushed open the door, stepping into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. Because now it wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing what kind of future they wanted to live in, and fighting for it no matter the cost.